Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another midweek mystery video. Now, one of you mentioned this particular mystery in the comments of my video on the Great Plague of London, and I just knew I had to cover it. It's not the typical mystery that I usually cover on this channel, but it's just as fascinating nonetheless. But before we get stuck into this week's video, I just want to give a huge thank you to this week's sponsor, June's Journey. June's Journey is a free mystery game set in the 1920s. We have to help June solve a murder whilst uncovering some deep family secrets. This is a hidden object mystery game. You have to find the objects to help June solve the mystery. This isn't a stressful game at all, it's not spooky, it's just easy to play and allows you to sit back and chill out for a second while still using your brain. You know, I think using your brain is very important. June's Journey first contacted me to work together at the beginning of the year, and I have literally played the game almost every single day since then. So I can vouch for how good this game is, and I was very happy when they wanted to work together again. So if you want to download the game, it will be linked in the top line of the description down below. You won't regret it. So, over 500 years ago, in the July of 1518, something very strange happened in the city of Strasbourg in France. It started with just a few people dancing outdoors, their arms flailing and their clothes soaked with sweat. Their bodies swayed or more like convulsed spasmodically. They would dance for days, their eyes glassed over, all day and all night until their eventual collapse or death. And this all started with just one woman, Frau Trophea, who started dancing on the 14th of July on the cobbled street outside of her home. There was no music, she just danced. Her husband pleaded with her to stop, but she either couldn't or she wouldn't. Eventually, she collapses from exhaustion before standing up the next day and continuing. By the third day, she had an audience. She continues dancing for 4 to 6 days, at which point the authorities send her away in a wagon to Severn, hoping she would be cured at the shrine of Vetus, who was the saint they believed cursed her with this choriomania. But it was a little bit too late. Some of those who had stood in the audience watching her had begun to mimic the dancing. Within days, more than 30 people were dancing in the street, and it seemed that only death could stop them. Whilst the religious believed that the affliction was the work of the vengeful Saint Vetus, doctors believed the dance to be a natural disease which was the result of overheated blood. They recommended that the only treatment was that the victims must dance themselves free of it. Some of the more religious authorities took the victims to the shrine of St. Vetus, where their bloodied and swollen feet would be placed in red shoes and led around a wooden figure of the saint in an effort to cure them of the dancing. But as you can imagine, this didn't really work. And so the authorities took a different approach. Carpenters were ordered to transform the guild halls into temporary dance floors and to set up platforms in the horse and grain markets in full view of the public. Musicians were paid to play their instruments, and healthy dancers were brought in to further encourage the afflicted to dance this disease out of their systems. They hoped to create the optimal conditions for the dance to just exhaust itself. But this all kind of backfired, because the more public this dancing became, the more people that began to dance. Records showed that by the end of the month, more than 400 citizens of Strasbourg had started to dance. So the authorities changed their tact and ordered all the stages to be pulled down with immediate effect, and the dancers were ordered to continue their thing in private. And they went even further than that, prohibiting all dance and music in the city throughout the summer. All music and dance was banned until September. And this was a pretty big thing, because dancing and music was pretty much the only community event in this time, particularly throughout the summer. At weddings, people were only allowed to use stringed instruments. Apparently they weren't as bad as other instruments. Eventually the dancing died down, and it had stopped by late August, early September. One of the strangest chapters in history had finally come to an end. And I want to make it clear that all history records are clear on the fact that this event did take place. It's not an urban legend, as odd as it sounds, and these documents are unambiguous on the fact that these victims danced. They were not trembling, they weren't shaking or convulsing. It was as if they were entranced. Their arms and legs moved purposefully, as if they were dancing. They were dancing. But the sources are unclear when it comes to the deaths. Nowhere is it mentioned the number of deaths from this, or even if there were any fatalities at all. but I think we can probably assume there were from exhaustion if not anything else. One source by a writer who lived near the city said up to 15 people a day died from it, but I couldn't find this backed up in any other historical sources. So what caused this very strange phenomenon? I've already mentioned the religious theory that St. Vitus had made people do this, and the theory from the doctors that it was caused by hot blood. One medical professor of the time actually said that the dancing was really just a ploy from Frau Troffea to embarrass her husband. He said that in order to make the deception as perfect as possible and to really give this impression of illness, Frau Troffea hopped and sang, which was almost distasteful to her husband. Upon seeing the success of her trick, other women began to dance to annoy their husbands as well. They were powered by free, lewd and impertinent thoughts. But the only problem with this is that the males were dancing too, and nobody said that they were dancing to embarrass their wives. They couldn't think of any explanation as to why the males would be dancing. So let's dive into some actual theories now that we have more knowledge about these kinds of things. For some time, ergotism was a solid contender. Ergotism is long-term poisoning produced by eating food affected by ergo, which is a type of fungus that infects rye and other cereals that produces a chemical kind of similar to LSD. It typically results in headaches, vomiting, diarrhea, and gangrene of the fingers and toes. It can also induce terrifying hallucinations and violent twitching, convulsions. It likely wouldn't have caused the kind of rhythmic dancing seen here. The moves seemed more purposeful than just random convulsions. But ergo also caused restricted blood flow to the extremities, which is what often causes the gangrene on the side effects. And that surely means that somebody would not be able to dance for several days in a row. And plus, not everyone would react to ergotism in the same way. And also, the dancing plague of Strasbourg wasn't the only break in the region at the time. In fact, it was quite a common illness, with virtually every outbreak of this dancing plague happening somewhere along the Rhine and Moselle rivers. The areas were linked by water, but they had hugely different climates and crops, meaning that it's unlikely that this dancing plague was caused by ergotism because they weren't all eating the same crops, and not all crops are going to be infected by this. The most widely accepted theory nowadays is that this was simply a case of mass hysteria. Mass hysteria is a type of psychogenic illness, something that begins in the mind rather than the body. But the physiological symptoms that come along with it are very much real. It's not somebody pretending to do something because other people are. It's just as uncontrollable as any other physical or mental illness. It's speculated that the dancing plague was a stress-induced psychosis on a mass level. The area was riddled with starvation and disease, and the inhabitants tended to be superstitious and God-fearing. 1517 was a particularly bad year in this region. It was the perfect condition for people in the city to truly believe that God was angry with them, and that maybe St. Vitus was after them after all. Maybe that's what happened with Frau Troffea, or maybe her dancing was just random. But once officials started saying that this was a punishment from St. Vitus, more of these God-fearing people would have believed it, and subconsciously they begin dancing too. And I can't stress that this was subconscious enough. They wouldn't have been thinking like, oh, I'm going to start dancing because Frau Troffea is. They would have just danced because their brain was telling them to. And there was another example of mass hysteria happening across Europe in the 1700s. Across European convents, there was reports of nuns writhing, convulsing and foaming at the mouth. They were climbing trees and meowing like cats. Their behaviour was obviously incredibly strange, but these nuns were just entrenched in stories about God. Their job basically being to obsess over their sins. Once one person started acting this way and they were told it was a punishment from God, other people would start acting that way subconsciously. It seems like religion can be a huge trigger for mass hysteria. There's no real explanation for mass hysteria, it's just something that happens, which sounds like a bit of a cop-out theory here, but really is all that they've got. It's the only thing they have to describe why this dancing plague happened. But there are more recent examples of mass hysteria as well, in case you're not completely convinced here. Strangely, it's most often adolescent females who are affected by it. In October 1965, at a school in Blackburn, England, several girls complained of dizziness. Some of these girls fainted, and within a couple of hours, 85 of these girls were rushed to hospital after fainting. Other symptoms included swooning, moaning, chattering teeth, hypernia, and tetany. But all clinical tests came back as negative. There was nothing wrong with them. It was later established that the outbreaks began among the 14-year-olds, but they quickly moved to younger age groups. The girls were later given personality tests, and it was established that the more extroverted and neurotic girls were affected other than the opposite personality types. And in 1962, there was an outbreak of laughter in the village of Kashasha in Tanzania, near the Ugandan border. It began in the January at a boarding school for girls. The laughter started with 3 girls and eventually spread through the whole school, affecting 95 pupils aged 12 to 18. These girls would go home and spread their laughter to their families, and it spread from there. In all, 14 schools were shut down and 1,000 people were affected. This lasted for 18 months with reports of fainting, respiratory problems, rashes, crying and screaming alongside the laughter. So mass hysteria is a real thing, and it seems like this is what happened in Strasbourg in 1518. Imagine something like that happening nowadays. Imagine going to London and seeing people randomly dancing in the streets, unable to stop. I mean, there's nothing to say that it couldn't happen nowadays. Maybe it will happen again very soon. I know this mystery was a little bit different this week, guys, but I found it really fascinating and I wanted to talk about it, and I hope you guys found it as interesting as I did. As always, give me your requests for cases down below, and make sure you check out June's journey, first line of the description. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye guys.